What most Americans don't realize is that when General Motors announced it was shutting down its CAMI assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, they weren't just closing a factory, they were testing a fundamental assumption about power that has governed North American economics for decades. The assumption that Canada would always absorb the shock, issue the usual protests, and ultimately accept whatever outcome American corporations decided was most profitable. That assumption, as it turns out, was catastrophically wrong. I want to take you through what actually happened here because the surface story most people heard completely missed the deeper institutional lesson. On the surface, this looked like another familiar tale of globalization doing what globalization does. A major corporation announces restructuring, points to market conditions and strategic necessity, workers get displaced, politicians make statements, and life moves on. If that's all you saw, you missed the most important economic confrontation between the United States and Canada in a generation. When I examine this sequence of events, what strikes me most forcefully is not what General Motors did, but what Canada did in response. And more importantly, what that response reveals about how economic power actually functions when political assumptions collide with institutional reality. Let me start with the story as most people understood it. General Motors, facing what it described as weak demand for the vehicles produced at the Ingersoll plant, announced the closure would affect over 1,000 workers. The company framed this as a necessary adjustment to its electric vehicle strategy, the kind of painful but inevitable decision that modern manufacturing requires. Standard corporate language, standard economic logic. The kind of announcement that has become so routine that most people file it away as background noise in an economy where change is constant and adaptation is demanded. What made this different was not the closure itself, but the context surrounding it. For years, both federal and provincial Canadian governments had provided General Motors with substantial public support, subsidies, tax incentives, infrastructure investments, workforce development programs. All of this assistance had been justified with a very specific promise that GM would maintain a long-term commitment to Canadian production, particularly in the transition to electric vehicles. Workers had been told they were building the future. Communities had organized their economic planning around these assurances. Taxpayers had been asked to invest in a partnership that would secure jobs and anchor Canada's position in the automotive industry's transformation. When GM walked away from that plant, it wasn't simply making a business decision, it was breaking a social contract, a contract that said public money comes with public obligations, that you don't take billions in support intended for long-term industrial capacity and then quietly exit when quarterly projections stop looking optimal. This is where most coverage of the story went wrong. It treated GM's decision as economically neutral, as if corporations exist in a vacuum where public investment creates no reciprocal responsibility. But here's what happened next, and this is where the institutional analysis becomes crucial. Instead of following the familiar script of protest and accommodation, Canada did something that stunned the automotive industry. Ottawa moved quickly and decisively to strip General Motors of key trade privileges that had allowed the company to sell US-built vehicles into Canada without facing tariffs. Almost overnight, cars that had crossed the border freely for years were hit with substantial duties. These were not symbolic penalties or angry gestures. They were real, immediate costs that landed directly on GM's balance sheet. The response was swift and telling. Suddenly, the math that had justified abandoning Canadian production stopped working. When executives who had calculated that they could extract public benefits and then relocate production discovered that market access was conditional on honoring commitments, the entire cost structure shifted. This wasn't about emotion or nationalism. It was about leverage being applied exactly where it would be felt most acutely. What you were really witnessing here was a test of whether modern democratic states are willing to enforce accountability when corporations treat public investment as a one-way transfer. For decades, the implicit understanding had been that multinational firms held the upper hand in these relationships. they could always threaten to leave. They could point to lower costs elsewhere, more accommodating regulatory environments, better incentive packages. Governments, especially smaller ones like Canada's, were expected to compete by offering more concessions, fewer strings, and less oversight. This dynamic had hardened into what I can only describe as a form of economic vassalage. Public money flowed to private firms with minimal conditions because the alternative was framed as economic catastrophe. Lose the plant, lose the community, lose the jobs. Politicians facing that choice, particularly in manufacturing regions, convinced themselves that any deal was better than no deal. Over time, this created a system where corporate commitments were treated as flexible suggestions, while public subsidies were treated as permanent entitlements. What Canada demonstrated in its response to GM was that this arrangement was never as stable as it appeared. The trade privileges that GM had been using were not gifts. They were conditional arrangements that lowered costs for companies in exchange for maintaining economic activity, employment, and investment within Canada. When those conditions were violated, the privileges could be withdrawn. The mechanism already existed. What had been missing was the political will to use it. This is where the deeper lesson about power becomes visible. When Ottawa imposed those tariffs, it wasn't inventing a new weapon, it was applying rules that had always been available but rarely enforced. What changed was not the legal framework, but the willingness to treat that framework as something more than a suggestion. And this shift exposed something that many people in corporate boardrooms had forgotten. Trade relationships are not natural phenomena. They are structured arrangements that require ongoing political maintenance. The immediate effect was dramatic. General Motors found itself in a position where vehicles shipped from U.S. plants into Canada carried costs that made pricing untenable. These weren't marginal adjustments that could be absorbed through efficiency gains. They were structural shifts that required fundamental recalculation of where production made economic sense. Within months, scenarios that had seemed unthinkable, like restarting Canadian production or assigning new models to the Ingersoll plant, were back on corporate planning tables. But the broader effect was even more significant. Other automakers across North America were watching carefully. This is an industry that learns fast when pain is involved. Companies that had assumed Canadian market access was essentially guaranteed regardless of their production decisions suddenly understood that this assumption was no longer safe. Not because Canada had become hostile to foreign investment, but because it had demonstrated that access to Canadian consumers was conditional on honoring commitments to Canadian workers. What you were seeing here was not protectionism in any traditional sense. This was enforcement. Canada was not blocking trade or demanding impossible conditions. It was simply applying the rules that had always existed but had been treated as optional. When those rules suddenly became real, the reaction from corporate America was not outrage so much as surprise. This wasn't how the relationship was supposed to work, at least not from the perspective of firms that had grown accustomed to asymmetrical bargaining power. For workers caught in the middle of this dispute, the government's response represented something they rarely experience in modern capitalism. It represented institutional defense of their interests against corporate abandonment. This doesn't mean the policy was perfect or that it solved every problem. Many workers still faced uncertainty and disruption. But it did signal that when companies violate commitments made with public money, there would be consequences. Not just political rhetoric, but economic consequences that corporations care about. The deeper strategic lesson here extends far beyond one automaker or one plant closure. What Canada demonstrated was that the institutional architecture of North American trade gives smaller countries more leverage than they often realize. The key is understanding how that architecture works and being willing to use it consistently rather than apologetically. This requires recognizing that cooperation and enforcement are not opposites. They are complementary tools that maintain balance in relationships where power is otherwise unequal. From an American perspective, this should be deeply concerning. When your closest ally feels compelled to enforce basic reciprocity through economic pressure, it suggests that the assumption of automatic deference has been pushed too far. It indicates that the relationship has become extractive in ways that undermine long-term cooperation. And it reveals how quickly trust can erode when institutional norms are treated as obstacles rather than foundations. What makes this moment especially significant is how it connects to broader patterns in American foreign economic policy. The tendency to assume that allies will accommodate disruption indefinitely. The practice of treating partnership as a form of leverage rather than mutual benefit. The habit of confusing short-term acquiescence with genuine consent. All of these tendencies were on display in how GM approached its Canadian operations, and all of them were challenged by Canada's response. The institutional memory here matters enormously. Canada's willingness to enforce trade rules with economic teeth sends a signal to every multinational corporation operating within its borders. It says that subsidies are not free gifts, but conditional arrangements. That market access comes with responsibilities that don't disappear when profit margins tighten. That public investment creates public obligations that will be enforced when necessary. This precedent reshapes the entire bargaining environment. When companies know that rules will be applied consistently, they plan differently. They make more durable commitments. They invest in relationships rather than just extracting benefits. This doesn't eliminate business flexibility, but it does ensure that flexibility is negotiated rather than simply imposed. For the United States, the lesson is more uncomfortable. This episode exposed how much American economic influence depends on the voluntary cooperation of allies who have been taken for granted. When that cooperation becomes conditional, when partners start enforcing their own interests through available institutional mechanisms, the balance of power shifts in ways that cannot be reversed through pressure alone. The automotive industry provides an especially clear example because it operates through such integrated supply chains. When Canada demonstrated that it was willing to disrupt those chains to enforce accountability, it forced a recognition that interdependence cuts both ways. American firms depend on Canadian cooperation not just for production inputs, but for market access. That dependence creates leverage, but only when it's acknowledged and used strategically. What concerns me most about this entire sequence is not Canada's assertion of its interests, but America's apparent surprise at that assertion. A mature economic relationship between sovereign nations requires mutual recognition of legitimate interests. When one side treats the other's concerns as essentially irrelevant, it creates the conditions for exactly the kind of confrontation we witnessed over the GM plant. Looking ahead, this precedent will likely influence how other trade disputes are handled. Canada has demonstrated that it possesses effective tools for enforcing corporate accountability and that it's willing to use those tools when public commitments are violated. Other countries are undoubtedly taking note. The era of assuming that smaller allies will absorb economic disruption without meaningful response is ending. For American businesses and policymakers, this creates a new imperative for treating international partnerships as genuine relationships rather than exercises in leverage. It requires understanding that in an interconnected global economy, even the largest players depend on cooperation that cannot be taken for granted, and it demands recognition that trust, once damaged, is far more difficult to rebuild than it was to destroy in the first place. The GM plant closure and Canada's response will likely be remembered as a turning point, not because it represented a dramatic rupture in North American economic relations, but because it marked the end of assumptions that had governed those relations for decades. The assumption that public money comes without public obligations, the assumption that corporate flexibility justifies any level of community disruption, and most fundamentally, the assumption that power in economic relationships flows only in one direction. History suggests that institutions function best when all participants understand that rules apply to everyone. When some actors believe they are exempt from accountability, the entire system becomes unstable. What Canada did in response to General Motors was restore that accountability through available institutional mechanisms. The fact that this restoration felt surprising tells us more about how far those mechanisms had been allowed to atrophy than it does about Canada's intentions. The real test now is whether this example leads to broader recognition that sustainable economic relationships require genuine reciprocity, whether American corporations and policymakers understand that partnerships built on extraction eventually collapse under their own contradictions, and whether the institutional frameworks that govern North American trade are strengthened through consistent enforcement rather than weakened through selective application. What the GM lesson ultimately teaches us is that real power in complex economic systems comes not from the ability to impose costs unilaterally, but from the capacity to enforce mutual obligations consistently. Canada reminded everyone that it possesses that capacity. The question now is whether its most important partner will learn to respect it.